Imagine the silence. For 4 years, the continent of Europe had been deafened by the roar of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, and the screams of men. Now, in 1918, the guns fell silent. But the silence that settled over the battlefields of France and Belgium was not peaceful. It was the silence of the grave. Millions of young men were gone. Cities, farms, and forests were reduced to a ghastly, pockmarked mud. And into this silence walked the survivors, soldiers returning home to a Germany they had been told they were winning for. They were the front generation, hardened, disillusioned, and many of them physically and psychologically shattered. They came home not as heroes to a victory parade, but to a nation in shock, a nation on the brink of revolution, a nation that felt betrayed. They were told they had not been defeated on the battlefield, but stabbed in the back by politicians, Jews, and communists at home. This poisonous myth, the Dictatorship, was a seed. And it would find fertile soil in the heart of one particular veteran, a brooding, angry corporal from Austria named Adolf Hitler. While Germany smoldered, the victors, France, Britain, the United States, and Italy, gathered at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris in 1919. Their task was to build a lasting peace. But for France, bled white by the war, peace meant ensuring Germany could never rise again. The resulting treaty was not a negotiation, it was a diktat, a dictated peace. The terms were designed to shackle Germany for generations. Let's break down the pillars of this punitive peace. First, the War Guilt Clause, Article 231. This forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. This wasn't just a point of pride, it was the legal foundation for everything that followed. It was a national humiliation, a brand of shame burned onto the entire country. Second, crippling reparations. Germany was billed 132 billion gold marks, a sum so astronomical it was impossible to pay. It was the equivalent of demanding a bankrupt man pay for a palace he burned down. This debt would hang over the German economy for decades, a constant reminder of their subjugation. Third, territorial dismemberment. Germany was carved up. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. Rich industrial areas like the Saar and Upper Silesia were given away. Perhaps most humiliating of all, the Polish corridor was carved out of German land to give Poland access to the sea, physically separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The fatherland was made smaller, weaker, and dismembered. Fourth, military castration. The mighty German army was reduced to a mere 100,000 men, a domestic police force. It was forbidden from having tanks, an air force, or submarines. The Rhineland, Germany's industrial heartland bordering France, was to be permanently demilitarized, leaving the nation defenseless on its western flank. Back in Germany, the treaty was met with universal outrage. The newsprint of the day was filled with words like shameful peace and chains of Versailles. The new, fragile democratic government, the Weimar Republic, was faced with an impossible choice: refuse to sign and face a full-scale Allied invasion, or sign and be forever branded as the November criminals who acquiesced to Germany's humiliation. They signed. The consequences were immediate and devastating. To pay the first reparations installments, the government printed money. This led to one of the most catastrophic hyperinflations in history. People needed wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread. Life savings were wiped out overnight. The middle class was destroyed. In the chaos, extremists on both the left and the right battled in the streets. And in the beer halls of Munich, a fiery orator found his message. Adolf Hitler began to speak, and he connected all the dots for his listeners. The defeat, the humiliation, the economic misery, it was all, he screamed, the work of a conspiracy, the Marxists, the Weimar politicians, and international Jewry. He promised not just recovery, but revenge. He promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, restore German pride, and create a new, pure Reich that would last 1,000 years. The Treaty of Versailles did not cause Adolf Hitler. But it created the perfect petri dish, a nation steeped in bitterness, economic despair, and a thirst for a scapegoat, in which his toxic ideology could grow and eventually consume the world. The war to end all wars had, in fact, sown the seeds for an even more terrible conflict. Out of the ashes of the Kaiser's empire and the shock of defeat, a new, desperate experiment was born, the Weimar Republic. It was Germany's first true democracy, founded on a constitution written in the peaceful town of Weimar, far from the revolutionary turmoil of Berlin. On paper, it was one of the most liberal in the world, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, assembly, and the vote for all, including women. But this democracy was born under a curse. Its politicians, the November criminals, were the ones who had signed the armistice and the Treaty of Versailles. To millions of Germans, the Weimar Republic wasn't their government, it was a permanent monument to their national shame. It was a sickly child, attacked from its very first breath. From the far left, communist revolutionaries, inspired by the recent Bolshevik success in Russia, saw the chaos as their chance. They launched bloody uprisings, like the Spartacist revolt in 1919, aiming to sweep away the Republic and establish a Soviet Germany. From the far right, monarchists, former army officers, and violent nationalists despised the Republic as a betrayal of the old, powerful Germany. They launched their own coups, like the Kapp Putsch in 1920, where Freikorps paramilitaries marched on Berlin. The Weimar Republic was a fragile ship caught between the iceberg of communism and the hurricane of fascism. Then came the economic apocalypse. To pay the first crushing reparations bill from Versailles, and because its tax base was shattered, the Weimar government made a fateful decision: it started printing money. At first, it was a trickle. Then, it became a flood. And by 1923, it was a tidal wave that wiped out the very concept of value. This was the Great Inflation. Prices began to double, then quadruple, then increase by the hour. A loaf of bread that cost 160 marks at the beginning of 1923 cost 200 billion marks by the end of the year. People's life savings, stored in bank accounts or under mattresses, became worthless overnight. They were paid twice a day, and wives would rush to meet their husbands at the factory gate to grab the cash and run to the shops before the prices went up again. If you paused to tie your shoelace, you lost. The social fabric tore. The middle class, the doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, the savers who were the bedrock of any stable society, were utterly destroyed. They watched a lifetime of prudence and hard work vanish into thin air. Meanwhile, speculators and those with hard assets or foreign currency thrived in the chaos. The profound, gut-wrenching sense of injustice was palpable. Decency and hard work had been punished. Cunning and corruption had been rewarded. The German people were left traumatized, humiliated, and desperately searching for someone to blame. Amidst this economic hell, the political war escalated from parliamentary debates to outright street warfare. Cities like Berlin and Munich became battlegrounds. On one side were the communists of the KPD, with their red flags, promising a workers' revolution and the abolition of the failed capitalist system. Arrayed against them were the nationalists, a collection of veterans groups and newly formed militias. The most prominent of these was the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the Brown Shirts. They were the paramilitary thugs of the fledgling Nazi Party. Their mission was simple: meet communist violence with even greater, more brutal violence. The soundtrack of German cities was no longer traffic or conversation, but the stomp of marching boots, the roar of political chants, and the crack of pistol shots. In beer halls and in alleyways, these rival armies clashed with fists, clubs, and guns. The police and the Weimar government seemed powerless to stop it. The state was losing its monopoly on violence. And in the midst of this chaos, one man understood the power of this perpetual conflict. Adolf Hitler did not see the street violence as a problem to be solved, but as a tool to be wielded. He presented himself and his brown shirts not as mere politicians, but as the only force strong enough, brutal enough, and determined enough to save Germany from the communist threat and restore order. The very violence he helped foment became his primary selling point. The more unstable the Republic became, the more attractive his message of ruthless strength appeared to a terrified and exhausted population. The battlefield was set, not in the fields of France, but in the heart of Germany's cities. Before the rage, before the speeches, before the swastika, there was just a young man, a failure, an outcast, a drifter. In the pre-war years, Adolf Hitler was a figure of pity and frustration. A mediocre artist in Vienna, his applications to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts were rejected twice. He lived in homeless shelters and men's hostels, selling postcard paintings to survive. It was in the teeming, multicultural capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that his worldview began to curdle. Surrounded by what he saw as a Babylon of races, he absorbed the city's rampant anti-Semitism and pan-German nationalism, developing a bitter contempt for the Habsburg monarchy and the socialists and Jews he blamed for his personal failures. When the Great War erupted in August 1914, it was his salvation. Like thousands of other lost men, Hitler found a purpose. He later wrote that he fell to his knees and thanked heaven for the outbreak of the war. He enlisted not in the Austrian army, but in a German regiment. The 25-year-old drifter finally had a home, a uniform, and a cause to which he could dedicate his entire, fanatical being. Hitler was assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment as a Meldegänger, a dispatch runner. This was one of the most dangerous jobs on the Western Front. It required him to leave the relative safety of the trenches and carry messages between command posts and the front lines, often sprinting across open ground swept by artillery and machine gun fire. Contrary to what one might expect, Corporal Hitler was not an outcast here. He was considered a reliable, brave, and eccentric soldier. He was twice decorated for bravery, receiving the Iron Cross, 2nd class, and later the rare Iron Cross, 1st class, an uncommon honor for a low-ranking corporal. His comrades found him odd. He didn't grumble about the food or the lice, didn't chase after French women, and spent his spare time reading or sketching. He was fanatical in his duty. But this experience seared two things into his soul. First, the horror of the trenches confirmed his belief in a brutal, Darwinian struggle for existence. Second, and more importantly, he developed an almost mystical devotion to the German army, the Reichswehr. He saw it as a perfect, heroic institution, untainted by the petty politics of the home front. Then, in October 1918, just weeks before the end of the war, he was temporarily blinded in a British mustard gas attack near Ypres. He was evacuated to a military hospital in Pomerania. It was here, in the darkness of his blindness, that he received the news that would define the rest of his life: Germany had surrendered. The Kaiser had abdicated. A republic had been declared. The war was lost. For Hitler, the news of the surrender was not just a defeat, it was an impossibility. The army he revered, the comrades he had watched die in the mud, how could they have been defeated? He had seen the front lines, they still stood deep in France and Belgium. The explanation, he became convinced, was not a military one, but a political one. He embraced the stab-in-the-back myth, the Dolchstoßlegende. This was the poisonous lie that the German army had been on the verge of victory when it was betrayed and stabbed in the back by cowardly politicians, the November criminals who signed the armistice, and by Jews and Marxists on the home front who had fomented strikes and revolution. It was a fantasy, a complete inversion of the truth. The German High Command itself knew the army was collapsing and had begged the politicians to sue for peace. But the myth was far more powerful than the truth. Hitler described his moment of revelation in the hospital: "Everything went black before my eyes. I staggered and stumbled back to my ward and buried my aching head between the blankets and pillow." So it had all been in vain. Did all this happen so that a gang of wretched criminals could lay hands on the fatherland? I, for my part, decided to go into politics. His fanatical loyalty to the army was now transferred into a fanatical hatred for those he blamed for its betrayal. The drifter, the brave soldier, was gone. In his place was the vengeful politician, a man with a single, burning mission, to avenge the stab in the back, to destroy the Weimar Republic, and to punish the conspirators he held responsible. The war had created the monster, and the peace provided him with his mission. In the chaotic aftermath of the war, Munich was a seething cauldron of political extremism. Still in the army, Hitler was assigned to spy on political groups. In September 1919, he attended a meeting of a tiny, obscure outfit called the German Workers' Party, DAP. It was a handful of men debating in a dim, smoky beer hall. Hitler was about to leave unimpressed, when a member rose to advocate for Bavarian separatism from Germany. Something in Hitler, the Austrian pan-German nationalist, snapped. He rose to his feet and delivered a blistering, impromptu rebuttal, his voice crackling with a ferocious conviction that stunned the small audience. The party's founder, Anton Drexler, was mesmerized. He saw in this angry corporal a raw, untamed power. "Goodness, he's got a gob," Drexler remarked, "we could use him." They immediately offered him a membership card. After some thought, Hitler, member number 555, accepted. He had found his weapon. Hitler quickly took over the tiny party, renaming it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, the Nazis. He designed its symbol, the swastika, and its banner, the blood-red flag with the black swastika in a white circle. It was visually striking, meant to be a banner for a movement, a brand for a revolution. But what was the revolution about? The Nazi ideology was not a sophisticated philosophy, it was a brutal, emotional cocktail of resentments, built on a few core tenets. First, ultranationalism. The belief that the German Volk, people, were a master race, destined for greatness. This was a direct rejection of the humiliation of Versailles. Second, racial purity and antisemitism. This was the poisonous heart of the movement. Hitler twisted Darwin's theories of evolution into a social doctrine he called racial hygiene. He claimed that humanity was a hierarchy of races, with the Aryans at the top and Jews, Slavs, and others as untermenschen, subhumans. He portrayed Jews not as a religion, but as a parasitic, international conspiracy responsible for both communism and capitalism, whose goal was the destruction of Germany. They were the universal scapegoat. Third, Lebensraum, living space. Hitler argued that Germany was suffocating. Its destiny, he declared, was to conquer vast territories to the east, in Poland and Russia, displacing or enslaving the inferior Slavic populations to provide farmland and resources for the German master race. This was a direct call for a war of annihilation. Fourth, the Führerprinzip, the leader principle. This demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience to the leader, the Führer. Democracy was weak and decadent, only a single, all-powerful will could save Germany. This toxic vision was delivered by Hitler with an almost hypnotic oratory. He didn't argue with logic, he screamed, he whispered, he promised, he threatened. He told the desperate and the humiliated exactly what they wanted to hear, that they were special. Emboldened by his growing following, Hitler attempted to seize power in Munich by force. On November 8, 1923, he and his SA brown shirts stormed a political meeting in the Bergerbräukeler Beer Hall, declaring a national revolution, the Beer Hall Putsch. The next day, they marched on the Bavarian War Ministry, hoping to replicate Mussolini's March on Rome. It was a catastrophic failure. The police opened fire. 16 Nazis were killed, and Hitler dislocated his shoulder as he fled the scene. He was arrested and put on trial for high treason. But in a stunning twist, Hitler turned this defeat into his greatest propaganda victory yet. He used the trial as a national stage, portraying himself not as a traitor, but as a German patriot. He thundered against the government, captivating the nation with his defiance. He was found guilty, but the judges, sympathetic to his cause, gave him the minimum sentence, just 5 years in the comfortable Landsberg fortress, where he would serve only 9 months. It was in Landsberg that he dictated his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which laid out the entire Nazi blueprint for all to see: the hatred of Jews, the plan for Lebensraum, the contempt for democracy. After his release, he changed tactics. The revolution would not be by a coup, but from within. He would use the very tools of democracy, elections, propaganda, and backroom deals, to destroy it. Emboldened by his growing following, Hitler attempted to seize power in Munich by force. On November 8, 1923, he and his SA brown-shirts stormed a political meeting in the Bergerbräukeler Beer Hall, declaring a national revolution, the Beer Hall Putsch. The next day, they marched on the Bavarian War Ministry, hoping to replicate Mussolini's March on Rome. It was a catastrophic failure. The police opened fire. 16 Nazis were killed, and Hitler dislocated his shoulder as he fled the scene. He was arrested and put on trial for high treason. But in a stunning twist, Hitler turned this defeat into his greatest propaganda victory yet. He used the trial as a national stage, portraying himself not as a traitor, but as a German patriot. He thundered against the government, captivating the nation with his defiance. He was found guilty, but the judges, sympathetic to his cause, gave him the minimum sentence, just 5 years in the comfortable Landsberg fortress, where he would serve only 9 months. For the next 8 years, he built his party, perfected his message, and waited for his moment. That moment came in 1929 with the Great Depression. As millions were thrown out of work, as the Weimar Republic staggered, the Nazis offered simple, violent solutions. In election after election, they went from a fringe party to the largest party in the German Reichstag. The established elites, conservative politicians, industrialists, and army generals, thought they could control this bohemian corporal. They saw him as a useful tool to crush the communists and break the deadlock in parliament. On January 30, 1933, after a series of backroom intrigues, the 85-year-old President Paul von Hindenburg, with immense reluctance, appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. As torchlight parades of triumphant SA men marched through Berlin, the democratic world watched in disbelief. The demagogue from the beer halls had entered the chancellery. The doors of the cage were now open. Adolf Hitler did not seize power with guns alone. His most potent weapon was his voice, and his chief strategist in this war of ideas was a gaunt, crippled, and fanatically devoted man named Joseph Goebbels. Together, they understood a fundamental truth that their democratic opponents did not: that in an age of mass media and mass despair, politics is not about reasoned debate, it is about the conquest of hearts through emotion, spectacle, and myth. Goebbels, who would become the Reich Minister of Propaganda, famously stated, "Think of the press as a great keyboard on which the government can play." And Hitler was the lead soloist. He was not a conventional speaker, he was a master of stagecraft and psychological manipulation. He would often begin his speeches slowly, almost awkwardly, feeling the mood of the crowd. Then, he would build, his voice rising in pitch and volume, his gestures becoming more frantic, his language shifting from logical points to raw, emotional appeals. He didn't just speak to the crowd, he merged with it, absorbing its fears and angers and reflecting them back as fury and promise. Listeners didn't just hear a speech, they experienced a catharsis. The Nazi message was simple, repetitive, and delivered with relentless force. Goebbels' principles were brutal in their simplicity. Simplify and repeat, ideas must be reduced to slogans that a child could understand. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one empire, one leader. Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. These phrases were repeated in newspapers, on posters, on the radio, until they became accepted as truth. The big lie, as Hitler himself wrote in Mein Kampf, the size of a lie is itself a factor in being believed. A lie too colossal and audacious, repeated with enough conviction, would be accepted because people would not believe anyone could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Channel existing grievances. They did not create German resentment from scratch. They tapped into the deep, pre-existing wells of anger over Versailles, the economic chaos, and the fear of communism. They simply provided a single, simple explanation and a single, ruthless enemy. Control all media. Once in power, the Nazis seized control of every facet of cultural life. Newspapers that opposed them were shut down. Radio stations broadcast Hitler's speeches live into every home and public square. Cheap, mass-produced radios, the Volksempfänger or People's Receiver, were sold to ensure the Führer's voice could reach every corner of the Reich. But it wasn't just what they said, it was how they made people feel. They created a new state religion, replacing the cross with the swastika. They mastered the art of spectacle, the massive Nuremberg rallies, with their seas of flags, their synchronized marching, and their dramatic light shows, were designed to make the individual feel small, but part of a vast, powerful, and glorious whole. It was emotional engineering on an industrial scale. To witness a Hitler speech was to be subjected to a form of psychological assault. He would carefully manipulate the timing, often speaking in the evening when people were more susceptible to emotional suggestion. He used what the historian Sir Ian Kershaw called the technique of the visionary. He didn't just promise a better economy, he promised a 1,000-year Reich, a racial utopia, a destiny ordained by Providence. He would work himself, and by extension the crowd, into a state of near hysterical ecstasy. A British journalist described it as a form of contagious frenzy. People, especially those who felt lost and powerless, were offered a sense of belonging, purpose, and superiority. They were no longer unemployed workers or bankrupt shopkeepers, they were the chosen warriors of a new Aryan age. This combination, the raw, hypnotic power of Hitler's oratory and the sophisticated, all-encompassing machine of Goebbels' propaganda, created a feedback loop of fanaticism. The rallies generated footage for propaganda films, which swelled the ranks for the next rally. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of myth-making. In the end, they did not just win votes, they captured imaginations and annihilated critical thought. They convinced a modern, educated nation to surrender its rationality to the cult of a single, infallible leader. The stage was now set not for a political campaign, but for a national hypnosis from which Germany would not awake for 12 long, terrible years. By November 1923, Adolf Hitler was a regional celebrity in Bavaria, but he was growing impatient. The Weimar Republic was teetering, crippled by hyperinflation. Inspired by Mussolini's successful march on Rome, Hitler decided his moment had come. He would seize Bavaria and then march on Berlin to topple the government. On the evening of November 8, he stormed into a packed political meeting at Munich's Bergerbräukeler Beer Hall. Brandishing a pistol, he fired a shot into the ceiling and declared a national revolution. In a dramatic backroom, he coerced the stunned Bavarian leaders, including the revered General Ludendorff, to support his coup at gunpoint. Initially, it seemed to work. The next morning, November 9, Hitler, Ludendorff, and approximately 2,000 of their brown-shirted SA stormtroopers began their march into the city center. They aimed to seize the Bavarian War Ministry. But the state authorities had regained their nerve. As the column turned onto a narrow street called Residenzstrasse, they were blocked by a cordon of state police. A standoff ensued. Shouts were exchanged. Then, a single shot rang out, from which side, no one knows. In an instant, the street erupted in a volley of gunfire. The air filled with the smell of cordite and the screams of men. In 60 seconds, it was over. 14 Nazis and 4 policemen lay dead. The putsch had collapsed. Hitler, his shoulder dislocated either from diving to the pavement or being pulled down by a falling comrade, fled and was arrested 2 days later. The revolutionary had failed spectacularly. Hitler's trial for high treason should have been the end of him. Instead, he transformed the courtroom into his most powerful national platform yet. He wore his failure as a badge of honor, openly admitting his aims and blaming the government for Germany's plight. The sympathetic judges gave him a mere 5-year sentence in the comfortable Landsberg fortress. It was here, in a sunlit private room, that the failed revolutionary was reborn as the strategic politician. He was treated as a celebrity, receiving gifts and admirers. And it was here that he dictated his book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. This rambling, hate-filled text was more than an autobiography, it was the unvarnished, public blueprint for the Third Reich. In it, he laid out everything. His fanatical anti-Semitism, identifying Jews as the racial tuberculosis of nations. His demand for Lebensraum, living space in the East. His contempt for democracy and parliamentary procedure. His belief in the Führerprinzip, the absolute authority of the leader. But the most important outcome of his imprisonment was a strategic revelation. The failed putsch taught him a critical lesson: he could not seize power against the army and the state. He would have to be invited to power by the very establishment he despised. He needed to use the system to destroy the system. As he later said, he decided to unbuckle his pistol and pursue a path of legality. After his early release, serving only 9 months, Hitler was a changed man tactically, but his goal remained the same. The Nazi Party was in disarray and banned. His first task was to rebuild it, and this time, he would focus on winning votes and manipulating the levers of government, not storming them. For years, it was a slow, grinding process. The Nazis remained a French party. But Hitler was patient. He perfected his propaganda machine under Goebbels and built a formidable party structure that could contest elections across the country. Then, in 1929, the Great Depression struck. Banks collapsed, factories shut, and unemployment soared to over 6 million. The moderate center of German politics shattered. Desperate people turned to extremes. The communists promised a workers' revolution. The Nazis promised national salvation, order, and a scapegoat. In this chaos, the Nazis went from a fringe movement to a political powerhouse. In the 1930 election, they won 18% of the vote. By July 1932, they were the largest party in the Reichstag, with 37% of the vote. The backroom deals began. The old conservative elite, bankers, industrialists, and nationalist politicians, saw Hitler as a useful, if unrefined, tool. They believed they could use his popular appeal to crush the communists, break the political deadlock, and then control him. They were fatally wrong. After a series of complex political intrigues, the path was cleared. On January 30, 1933, the 85-year-old President Paul von Hindenburg, with immense reluctance, appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. The man who had once been jailed for treason now held the keys to the state. The path of legality had reached its terrifying destination. The system had, as he planned, invited the destroyer inside. For a few brief years, from 1924 to 1929, it seemed as if the Weimar Republic might just survive. A new currency, the Reichsmark, had ended the hyperinflation. Under the Dawes Plan, American loans flowed into Germany, rebuilding its industry. Berlin became a glittering, world-renowned center of art, science, and culture, a period known as the Golden Twenties. Cafes were full, new buildings reached for the sky, and for the urban, liberal elite, there was a sense of optimism. But this prosperity was a fragile illusion, built on a foundation of foreign debt. Beneath the surface, the old resentment still simmered. Many traditional Germans saw the vibrant culture not as progress, but as moral decay, a symptom of the Judeo-Bolshevik influence they despised. The economic stability was real, but it was a house of cards. And in 1929, a shockwave from across the Atlantic would blow it all down. In October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed. Panic swept through the American financial system. To save themselves, American banks immediately called in their short-term loans to Germany. The effect was catastrophic. The lifeblood of the German economy was cut off. Factories that depended on this credit began to shutter their gates almost overnight. The sound of industry was replaced by the silence of unemployment. The numbers are staggering. By 1932, over 6 million Germans were out of work, nearly 1 in 3 workers. And these weren't just statistics, they were human beings. Men who had provided for their families now stood in endless soup kitchen lines. Young university graduates found their degrees utterly worthless. It was a level of economic despair that dwarfed even the hyperinflation, because this time there was no hope, no activity, just a permanent, grinding stillness. The Democratic Center, the parties that supported the Weimar Republic, had no answers. They argued over budget cuts and austerity measures, which only made the suffering worse. To the millions standing in the cold, democracy appeared weak, indecisive, and utterly bankrupt of ideas. When people are comfortable, they can afford principles. When they are desperate, they demand solutions, any solutions, no matter how radical. Into this vacuum of hope marched the extremists. On one side, the communists promised a proletarian revolution and the overthrow of the entire capitalist system. This terrified the middle class, the business owners, and the rural population. On the other side stood Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. They did not offer complex economic theories. They offered simple, emotional, and brutal explanations and solutions. Their message was perfectly tailored to the crisis. Who is to blame? They pointed not to abstract market forces, but to tangible enemies, the November criminals who signed the Versailles Treaty, the Jewish financiers who controlled international capital, and the Marxist agitators who wanted to destroy Germany from within. What is the solution? They promised not just recovery, but national rebirth. They vowed to repudiate the Versailles Treaty, kick out the parasites, and put every German back to work building a new, powerful Germany, building autobahns, and more ominously, rebuilding the military. While the traditional parties talked of austerity, the Nazis promised action, strength, and unity. Their rallies were a spectacle of order and power in a world of chaos. For a young, unemployed man, the SA Brownshirts offered a uniform, a daily meal, a sense of purpose, and a channel for his rage. The election results tell the story. In 1928, the Nazis were a fringe party with less than 3% of the vote. By 1930, they skyrocketed to over 18%. By July 1932, they were the largest party in the Reichstag with 37%. The Great Depression had not just created economic misery, it had shattered faith in the rational, democratic world. It made a nation of one of the world's most educated peoples receptive to the politics of fear, scapegoating, and the seductive, simple lie of a savior. The economic collapse was the catalyst that turned a militant movement into a mass phenomenon, placing Hitler at the very threshold of power. By the end of 1932, Germany was trapped in a political nightmare. The Nazis were the largest party, but they did not have a majority. The Communist Party was growing. The Reichstag was paralyzed, unable to form a stable government. President Paul von Hindenburg, the 85-year-old field marshal and revered figurehead, despised Hitler, referring to him privately as the Bohemian Corporal. He had previously refused to appoint him chancellor. But a small, powerful cabal of conservative aristocrats, bankers, and nationalist politicians believed they had found a solution. Led by former Chancellor Franz von Papen, they hatched a plan. They would convince the reluctant Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor. Their reasoning was cynical and, they believed, brilliant, Hitler had the mass popular support they lacked. They would give him the title, but in a cabinet filled with their own men, only 3 out of 11 ministers would be Nazis. Von Papen would be vice-chancellor, and they would control the old, aristocratic Hindenburg. They would frame Hitler, using his energy and popularity to restore order, crush the communists, and then, as von Papen infamously boasted, push him so far into a corner that he'll squeak. They were convinced they had tamed the demagogue, turning him into their puppet. Hindenburg resisted fiercely. He saw Hitler as a vulgar upstart, unworthy of the office once held by Bismarck. For weeks, the political intrigue swirled around the aged president. The key figure became his son, Oskar, and his state secretary, Otto Meissner, both of whom were won over by the conspirators' arguments and the promise of power. The final piece of the puzzle was the army. The Minister of Defense, General Kurt von Schleicher, a master of backroom politics himself, had lost the confidence of both the president and his fellow officers. He could not control the political chaos. The Army High Command, fearing a civil war between Nazis and communists, and reassured by the conservative frame around Hitler, gave its crucial, silent assent. They believed the Nazi stormtroopers could be absorbed into the state and the real army, the Reichswehr, would remain the true power. With no other viable government, and with his advisors warning of collapse and civil war, the tired, old Hindenburg finally capitulated. On the morning of January 30, 1933, he summoned Adolf Hitler to the presidential palace. The meeting was brief and formal. There would be no discussion of policy. The appointment was a fait accompli. That afternoon, just after noon, Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. The ceremony was subdued. But as dusk fell on Berlin, the Nazis unleashed their true celebration. From the Tiergarten to the Brandenburg Gate, a river of fire flowed through the heart of the city. Tens of thousands of SA brown shirts, SS men in black uniforms, and Stahlhelm veterans marched in a massive, endless torchlight parade. Their boots stamped a relentless, martial rhythm on the pavement. Their torches cast a flickering, blood-red glow on the grand buildings of Wilhelmstrasse, right past the windows of the Chancellery and the presidential palace. They sang the Horst-Wessel-Lied, the Nazi anthem, their voices a thunderous, terrifying choir. At the window, Adolf Hitler looked down upon his triumph, tears in his eyes. Beside him, Paul von Hindenburg watched the same scene with grim disapproval, mistaking the parade as a tribute to himself. He did not understand that this was not a celebration of the state, but a victory rally over it. That night, a young diarist named Louise Sommetz, who was not a Nazi, captured the mood of millions. We stood there, frozen, captivated, a river of fire, and we felt we could not be excluded from this mysterious, overwhelming experience. It was a spectacle of power that overwhelmed reason. The conservative plotters, watching from their own windows, finally felt a chill of fear. They had handed the keys of the state to a man who commanded a revolutionary army. The puppet had cut his own strings. January 30th was not the end of a political process. It was the beginning of a revolution. Just 4 weeks after becoming Chancellor, Hitler's fragile government was still constrained by the Constitution and a Reichstag where the Nazis did not hold a majority. He needed a crisis, a pretext to crush his opponents and seize emergency powers. On the night of February 27, 1933, he got one. The Reichstag, the symbol of German democracy, was engulfed in a massive, suspicious fire. Hitler, Goebbels, and Göring rushed to the scene. To the press, a frenzied Hitler declared, "This is a communist plot. Now we will show no mercy." A young, mentally unstable Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested at the scene. But the truth was far more sinister. While van der Lubbe may have acted alone, the Nazis seized the opportunity with breathtaking speed. They immediately claimed it was the signal for a nationwide communist uprising. The next day, they strong-armed the aging President Hindenburg into signing the Reichstag fire decree. This single decree suspended every essential civil liberty guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assembly, and privacy of communications. It was the beginning of the end of the rule of law. In the following days, thousands of communists, socialists, and other political opponents were rounded up by the SA and thrown into hastily prepared concentration camps, like Dachau. The terror had officially begun. With his opponents imprisoned and terrorized, Hitler demanded a new election for March 5. It was the most unfree and violent campaign Germany had ever seen. Nazi stormtroopers patrolled the streets, breaking up opposition rallies, while the state-controlled radio broadcast Nazi propaganda ceaselessly. Despite the intimidation, the Nazis still failed to win an outright majority, securing only 44% of the vote. But it was enough. On March 23, 1933, the new Reichstag was convened not in its burned-out home, but in the Kroll Opera House. The atmosphere was menacing. The building was surrounded by SA and SS men, who lined the corridors inside, shouting insults and threats at any remaining socialist and centrist deputies. Hitler now introduced the law for the removal of the distress of the people and the Reich, known to history as the Enabling Act. This law would give Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws without the consent of the Reichstag or the president for a period of 4 years. It was a constitutional suicide pact. To pass, it needed a 2/3 majority. Hitler secured it through a mixture of terror and deal-making. The Catholic Center Party was bribed with promises to protect their religious rights. The other parties were cowed into submission. Only the 94 Social Democrats, led by the brave Otto Wels, dared to vote against it. In a trembling voice, Wels declared, "You can take our lives and our freedom, but you cannot take our honor." When the vote was called, the Enabling Act passed. Democracy in Germany was dead. Hitler was now the legal dictator of the nation. With the Enabling Act in hand, Hitler and the Nazis began a process called Gleichschaltung, coordination or bringing into line. This was the systematic destruction of all independent institutions and the fusion of every aspect of German life with the Nazi Party. The states, all regional state governments were abolished. Germany became a centralized, top-down dictatorship. The unions, on May Day, 1933, the Nazis celebrated the worker. The very next day, they stormed and abolished all trade unions, replacing them with the Nazi-controlled German Labor Front. The media, all non-Nazi newspapers were shut down. The Ministry of Propaganda, under Joseph Goebbels, now controlled every book, film, and radio broadcast. The culture, degenerate art was banned. Artists, writers, and professors who did not conform were dismissed or fled into exile. The final act of consolidation came in the summer of 1934. Hitler's own SA, the Brown Shirts, had become a liability. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, dreamed of a second revolution and saw the regular army as old and obsolete. The Army High Command, in turn, saw the SA as a dangerous, unrivaled mob. To secure the army's loyalty, Hitler made a pact with them. On the night of the Long Knives, June 30, 1934, the SS murdered at least 85 people, including Röhm and the entire SA leadership, along with old conservative enemies like former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher. The message was clear: no one was safe. When Hindenburg died a month later, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer und Reichskanzler. The entire German armed forces now swore a personal oath of allegiance not to the Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler himself. The totalitarian state was complete. In the first 2 years of Nazi rule, the persecution of Jews was often violent and chaotic, driven by SA thugs boycotting Jewish shops and assaulting citizens. But by 1935, Hitler wanted to codify this hatred, to give it the cold, respectable veneer of law. The goal was to systematically strip Jewish Germans of their rights, their identity, and their humanity, all through legal decrees. The stage for this was the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg in September 1935, a vast, choreographed spectacle of party power. It was here, amidst the searchlights and marching columns, that Hitler unexpectedly summoned the Reichstag for a special session. He presented them with two laws, drafted in haste, that would become the cornerstone of Nazi racial policy, the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws were deceptively simple, but their impact was catastrophic. The first, the Reich Citizenship Law, created a new definition. It stated that only a person of German or related blood could be a Reichsbürger, a full citizen with political rights. All others, namely Jews, were now designated as mere Staatsangehörige, state subjects, stripped of their citizenship and the right to vote. The second, and more infamous, was the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor. This law made marriage and any extramarital intercourse between Jews and non-Jewish Germans a criminal offense, Rassenschande, or racial pollution. It also forbade Jews from employing female German servants under the age of 45, based on a vile, paranoid fantasy. But who was a Jew? A subsequent decree created a complex, pseudoscientific racial hierarchy. A full Jew had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents. A Mischling, mixed race, had 1 or 2. Your fate was now determined not by your religion or how you identified, but by the bureaucratic examination of your grandparents' birth certificates. Overnight, neighbors, decorated war veterans, and fully assimilated families who considered themselves German for generations were legally defined as aliens, as outcasts in their own homeland. It was the legal groundwork for their eventual removal from society, and worse. While the Nuremberg Laws provided the legal framework for persecution, a parallel system of raw terror was being perfected to enforce it. Just weeks after Hitler took power, on March 22, 1933, the first purpose-built concentration camp opened in a former munitions factory near the town of Dachau. Heinrich Himmler, then Munich's police chief, announced its purpose: to hold political prisoners, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and anyone else who opposed the regime. The early camps, run by the SA, were brutal and chaotic. But under the command of Himmler's SS, and specifically the fanatical Theodor Eicke, Dachau became something far more sinister, a model. Eicke created a detailed system of rules, uniforms, and brutal discipline that would be replicated across the camp system. Prisoners were stripped of their identity, becoming numbers. They were subjected to backbreaking labor, arbitrary punishments, and summary executions. The goal was not just to imprison, but to break the human spirit, to terrorize the entire population into submission. The message was clear: dissent, or simply being deemed an enemy of the state, meant being taken away by the Gestapo and disappearing into a place beyond the reach of law. By 1935, these two strands, the cold, bureaucratic discrimination of the Nuremberg Laws and the raw, extra-legal terror of the camp system, were woven together. One pushed a segment of the population to the margins of society, legally defenseless. The other stood ready to engulf them. The world watched, and many dismissed it as an internal German matter. But the architecture of the Holocaust was now under construction. By the summer of 1934, Adolf Hitler was the master of Germany, but his power was not yet absolute. A storm was brewing within his own movement, centered around his old friend and comrade, Ernst Röhm. Röhm was the leader of the Sturmabteilung, SA, the Brown Shirts. With over 3 million men, the SA was a massive, revolutionary, and unruly army. They had been the street brawlers who beat up communists and helped intimidate Hitler into power. But now, they were a problem. Röhm and his followers were social revolutionaries. They dreamed of a second revolution, to dissolve the old, aristocratic German army, the Reichswehr, and merge it with the SA to create a true People's Army, with Röhm at its head. The SA, many of whom were working class, saw themselves as the true vanguard of the Nazi revolution and grew restless with mere parades. For the traditional German army officers, this was an existential threat. They viewed the SA as an undisciplined, socialist-minded mob. They demanded that Hitler curb Rome's power. For Hitler, this was a moment of supreme crisis. He had to choose between his oldest, most loyal ally, and the one institution that could guarantee the regime's long-term stability, the army. The army generals made their price clear: crush the SA, and they would support Hitler as the successor to the dying President Hindenburg. Hitler, the ultimate opportunist, made his choice. He would sacrifice his old friend to secure the loyalty of the generals. The code word was hummingbird. On the weekend of June 30, 1934, Hitler personally led a convoy of SS men and Gestapo officers to a hotel in Bad Wiessee where Röhm and his SA leaders were vacationing. What followed was a nationwide, bloody purge that would be christened the Night of the Long Knives. In a scene of shocking betrayal, Hitler burst into Röhm's room, personally arresting his old comrade. Across Germany, SS execution squads, armed with blacklists, fanned out. They dragged SA leaders from their homes and offices, executing them on the spot in fields and prison courtyards. But the purge quickly expanded beyond the SA. It became Hitler's chance to settle old scores. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, who had tried to outmaneuver him, was shot dead in his home alongside his wife. Gustav von Kahr, who had thwarted the beer hall putsch in 1923, was found hacked to death in a swamp. Dozens of other perceived enemies, including critical conservatives and even a Nazi who had disobeyed Hitler years earlier, were murdered. The exact death toll is unknown but is estimated to be at least 85, with some estimates running into the hundreds. Back in Berlin, the terror was sanitized for public consumption. On July 13, Hitler addressed the Reichstag. He did not apologize, he justified the murders as a necessary act of state. He declared himself the supreme judge of the German people, claiming he had acted to crush a treasonous plot and save the nation. He famously stated, "At this hour, I was responsible for the fate of the German nation and thereby the supreme judge of the German people." The message was chillingly clear: the law was whatever the Führer said it was. There would be no trials, no appeals. Opposition, real or imagined, would be met with summary execution. Ernst Röhm was given a pistol and one bullet in his prison cell and told to do the honorable thing. When he refused, 2 SS officers entered the cell and shot him dead. The SA was neutered, its power broken and absorbed by the rival SS, which now emerged as the primary instrument of Nazi terror. The German public, weary of street violence, largely approved. They saw it as Hitler restoring order. The conservative elites and the army were thrilled, their rival was destroyed. They believed they had tamed Hitler. But in reality, they had made a pact with the devil who now understood his absolute power. He had murdered his way to an unshakable position. When Hindenburg died a month later, there was no one left to challenge him. The army swore its personal oath to Adolf Hitler, and he became the undisputed Führer. The Night of the Long Knives was the moment the Nazi revolution devoured its own, and in doing so, cemented a totalitarian dictatorship built on blood. Flush with success from the annexation of Austria, Hitler immediately turned his gaze eastward, to a country he contemptuously called the bastard child of Versailles, Czechoslovakia. Unlike Germany, Czechoslovakia was a vibrant democracy, but it was also a multi-ethnic state with a significant German minority of over 3 million people, known as the Sudeten Germans, living in the mountainous border regions. This territory, the Sudetenland, was not just any piece of land. It contained Czechoslovakia's formidable frontier defenses, a network of fortresses and bunkers that were the most modern in Europe. It was also the heart of the country's armaments industry, including the famous Skoda works. For the Czechs, losing the Sudetenland meant losing their ability to defend themselves. For Hitler, acquiring it was the essential first step to crushing Czechoslovakia and gaining the industrial muscle for his wider wars. He found his instrument in Konrad Henlein, the leader of the Sudeten German Party. On instructions from Berlin, Henlein began agitating, complaining of Czech oppression and making demands that the government in Prague could never accept. The goal was not to find a solution, but to create a permanent crisis. Through the spring and summer of 1938, Hitler whipped up a frenzy. The German press was filled with fabricated stories of Czech atrocities against Sudeten Germans. Henlein's followers clashed with Czech authorities. In May, partial Czech mobilization in response to German troop movements near the border revealed Hitler's plans before he was ready. He was furious, and swore that his next move would end in Czechoslovakia's destruction. The world watched with growing alarm. The Czechs had mutual defense treaties with both France and the Soviet Union. An attack on Czechoslovakia could trigger a continent-wide war. To avert this catastrophe, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, a man of peace who believed Hitler's grievances could be resolved through rational negotiation, decided to intervene. In September, Chamberlain, aged 69 and having never flown before, made 3 dramatic flights to Germany. He met Hitler at his mountain retreat, the Berghof. Hitler initially demanded the right of self-determination for the Sudeten Germans. Chamberlain, believing this was Hitler's final territorial demand in Europe, seemed to broker a peaceful transfer. But as soon as Chamberlain returned to London to secure approval, Hitler escalated his demands, now insisting on immediate German military occupation of the Sudetenland. He screamed at Chamberlain that he would smash the Czechs if his demands were not met. War seemed inevitable. In a final, desperate attempt to avoid war, Chamberlain appealed to Mussolini, who proposed a 4-power conference. On September 29, 1938, the leaders of Germany, Italy, Britain, and France gathered in Munich. Conspicuously absent were the Czechs and the Soviets. The Czech representatives were forced to wait in a separate room, hearing their nation's fate decided without them. The meeting was a sham. Hitler got everything he wanted. The Munich Agreement dictated that Czechoslovakia must cede the Sudetenland to Germany within 10 days. In return, Hitler gave his personal assurance that this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain returned to London a hero, waving a piece of paper signed by Hitler and declaring to a cheering crowd that he had brought peace for our time. He believed he had saved Europe from a catastrophic war. But in Prague, the reality was one of national suicide. The Czechs, abandoned by their allies, had no choice but to comply. They lost their defensible borders, their main fortifications, and a third of their industry. They were now utterly defenseless. Winston Churchill, a lone voice of condemnation in the British Parliament, saw the grim truth. He thundered, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." Hitler had not been appeased, he had been emboldened. He saw the democracies as weak, fearful, and unwilling to fight. Just 6 months later, in March 1939, he would tear up the Munich Agreement and send his troops to occupy the rest of a shattered Czechoslovakia. The policy of appeasement lay in ruins. The point of no return had been crossed. The next crisis would mean war. The date is September 29, 1938. Europe holds its breath, poised on the very brink of a war that everyone fears. The German army is massed on the Czech border. The Czechs have mobilized over 1 million men. France and Britain are preparing for the inevitable. In a last, desperate gamble to pull Europe back from the abyss, the leaders of the 4 great powers converge on Munich. But this is not a meeting of equals. Adolf Hitler, the agitator, hosts the conference, his demands already set in stone. Benito Mussolini, the fascist ally, provides the draft of the agreement, a document largely written by the Germans. And facing them are the 2 leaders of the great democracies, Neville Chamberlain of Britain and Édouard Daladier of France. Their mission, to preserve peace at any cost. But the cost, they would soon learn, was to be paid entirely by a nation whose representatives were not even allowed in the negotiating room. The Czech diplomats were held in a separate hotel, relegated to the role of spectators at their own national funeral. The negotiations were a foregone conclusion. Hitler issued ultimatums, Chamberlain and Daladier acquiesced. The Munich Agreement dictated that Czechoslovakia must cede the Sudetenland, its vital defensive frontier and industrial heartland, to Nazi Germany. The transfer would begin the very next day. No plebiscite, no negotiation. It was a death sentence for the Czechoslovak state, signed by its supposed friends. For Chamberlain, this was not a defeat, but a triumph of statesmanship. He had, in his mind, tamed the German tiger. He had secured a separate piece of paper, signed by Hitler, affirming the desire of their two peoples never to go to war with one another again. As he prepared to depart, he believed he had achieved the Holy Grail, peace. Back in London, on September 30th, Chamberlain emerged from his airplane at Heston Aerodrome, waving that now infamous piece of paper. Beaming with pride, he read its contents to a jubilant press corps and a public sick with fear of war. Then, he spoke the words that would forever define the folly of appeasement. My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. The crowd erupted in cheers. They believed the nightmare was over. But while London celebrated, the reality on the ground was one of betrayal and catastrophe. In Paris, Premier Daladier, who had signed the same agreement, was morose. He looked out at the cheering crowds awaiting his return and muttered, "The fools, why are they cheering?" He knew France had betrayed its most loyal ally in Eastern Europe, shattering its own credibility. In Prague, the mood was one of utter devastation. The Czech government was given a brutal choice: submit to the dismemberment of their country, or face the German army alone. They capitulated. President Edvard Beneš, broken, resigned and fled into exile. Winston Churchill, a lone voice of prophetic warning in the British Parliament, saw the truth with stark clarity. He denounced the agreement, declaring, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." He was right. The Munich Agreement was the point of no return. Hitler had watched the democracies sacrifice their principles and their ally for the sake of peace. He saw their weakness and was convinced they would never fight. Just 5 months later, in March 1939, he sent his troops to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia, blatantly violating the Munich Agreement. The rump state, stripped of its defenses, offered no resistance. The illusion was shattered. Chamberlain's "peace for our time" had bought less than 6 months. In that time, Hitler had gained the Skoda Armaments Works, the second largest in Europe, and proven his war machine. The democracies, finally, awoke to the truth. When Hitler next made demands on Poland in the summer of 1939, Britain and France drew a line. The policy of appeasement was dead. But the war it was designed to prevent was now inevitable, and it would be fought under circumstances far more favorable to the dictator. After the Munich Agreement in September 1938, Czechoslovakia was a nation on life support. It had been dismembered, forced to surrender the Sudetenland, its mountainous spine, its formidable border defenses, and over a third of its industry. The country, now pathetically relabeled Czechoslovakia, was politically fractured and militarily indefensible. Its leaders lived in a state of grim uncertainty, clinging to the international guarantees that had been part of the Munich deal, promises that now felt as flimsy as the paper they were written on. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler watched the crippled state with cold calculation. The rump of Czechoslovakia was now surrounded by German territory on 3 sides. It was, in his words, a runt in the Reich space. He had never intended to stop at the Sudetenland. The entire nation was his goal. Just 5 months after Munich, he would deliver the final, cynical blow that would prove, beyond any doubt, that his word was worthless and that appeasement was a catastrophic failure. In early March 1939, Hitler set the stage for his final act. He instructed his proxies in Slovakia to agitate for independence, creating a manufactured crisis. On March 14, the Slovak parliament, under intense German pressure, declared independence. This gave Hitler the pretext he needed. That very evening, he summoned the aging and ailing Czech president, Emil Hácha, to Berlin. It was a scene of psychological torture. Hácha was forced to wait for hours before being ushered into the Reich Chancellery in the dead of night. There, he faced Hitler, Göring, and Ribbentrop in a terrifying spectacle. Hitler ranted about Czech betrayal and announced that German troops would invade at dawn to restore order. He then presented Hácha with an ultimatum: sign a document placing the fate of the Czech people, trustingly into the hands of the Führer, or witness the utter destruction of Prague by the Luftwaffe. Göring, looming over the frail president, threatened to reduce the city to a heap of rubble. Under this immense strain, President Hácha, who suffered from a heart condition, fainted. After being revived by Hitler's personal physician, he was put on the phone to Prague and, in a broken voice, ordered his government not to resist. He had signed his country's death warrant to save its people from a massacre. At dawn on March 15, 1939, German armies poured into the rest of Czechoslovakia. They met no resistance. By the afternoon, Hitler himself was in Prague, standing triumphantly in the ancient Hradčany castle, the seat of Czech kings. Bohemia and Moravia were declared a German protectorate. Czechoslovakia had ceased to exist. The reaction in London and Paris was one of shock and fury. They had been played for fools. The Munich Agreement was lies. Hitler's promise that the Sudetenland was his last territorial demand was lies. He had not been rectifying the injustices of Versailles, he was pursuing naked, unlimited aggression. Neville Chamberlain, the architect of appeasement, was finally forced to see the truth. In a speech in Birmingham on March 17, his tone was transformed from the hopeful peace for our time to one of grim realization. He asked, "Is this the last attack upon a small state, or is it to be followed by another? Is this, in fact, a step in the direction of an attempt to dominate the world by force?" The answer was clear to everyone. The occupation of Prague was different from all that had come before. This was not about uniting ethnic Germans with the Reich, this was the conquest of a Slavic nation. The policy of appeasement lay in ruins. In that moment, the British and French governments knew that the next time Hitler threatened a nation, and all signs pointed to Poland next, they would have to fight. The betrayal of March 1939 did not just destroy a country, it destroyed the last hope for peace. It was the final, brutal lesson that some appetites cannot be appeased, they can only be stopped by force.